listener production.
Hey, Chris Spyrou with you. Happy Monday and welcome to The Briefing. Around a dozen so-called ISIS brides from Syria could be back in Australia by the end of the year, according to latest news reports. And while the government is remaining tight-lipped about it all, what exactly goes into a repatriation like this?
It's sometimes made to sound by politicians as if it's impossibly difficult, like it's some sort of Tom Cruise Mission Impossible movie. It's actually fairly straightforward. It's not as if you can't make the transit from in and out of Syria. It's entirely possible.
So if it's not impossible, why has Australia only brought some of these women and their children home and not all of them? That's coming up in the second half of this episode. First though, let's get into the headlines with Helen Smith. It's Monday, the 8th of September.
Hey Chris, and to you listening, starting in Sydney, where a police investigation is underway after a brawl broke out on Bondi Beach between pro-Palestine and pro-Israel groups yesterday. Hundreds of pro-Palestine protesters, organised by the group Jews Against the Occupation, had gathered at the iconic beach on Sunday morning for a paddle out in support of Gaza and a flotilla attempting to break Israel's blockade on the region, when they were met by counter-protesters carrying Israeli and Australian flags, as well as a sign that read, "Hamas is the enemy of humanity."
Go back to Lakemba!
This is our land! We don't come to Lakemba! Don't come to Bondi!
And a note for listeners who aren't from Sydney there, Lakemba is a suburb in Sydney's southwest known for its large Arab Muslim community. Police did intervene to break up the scuffles after tensions flared and there were no reported injuries or arrests. Meantime, in Gaza, Israel has bombed another residential high-rise building, the third such attack since Friday. The IDF claims the 15-storey tower was a Hamas building as it continues with its plans to occupy the Strip, with aerial attacks overnight reportedly killing around 50 people sheltering in schools, tents or houses.
And in Israel, Ramon Airport in the country's south has resumed operations after it was attacked by Yemen's Houthi rebels overnight. The airport's passenger hall was struck by a drone that broke through the Iron Dome, injuring at least 5 people.
The families and friends of 2 young boys stabbed to death in Melbourne's west are calling on police for answers and protection. 15-year-old Dal Akouin was one of the boys found with serious stab wounds in Cobblebank on Saturday night. The other was just 12 years old. And that comes less than a week into the Victorian government's machete ban. Dal's dad was among those who spoke to media yesterday.
I'm talking in front of the camera right now on behalf of my community. This is happening to us. We buried this month 4 kids. There's no answer from police. There's no answer from justice. What I told police last night, I need an answer from my son. My son is just gone like this. He's a basketball player. He's not a criminal.
According to authorities, the boys were walking from a bus stop with a third friend before 8 p.m. on Saturday night when they were attacked by a group of 8 masked individuals. Victorian police say while the case had the hallmarks of youth gang crime, it was unlikely the victims were gang members and that it was a likely case of mistaken identity.
The New South Wales state government has paused shark net removal trials after a deadly attack on Sydney's northern beaches that killed 57-year-old avid surfer Mercury Psilakis. New South Wales Premier Chris Minns says pausing the trials that were set to remove nets from 3 New South Wales beaches was the right thing to do and that they won't be making any further decisions until the full report is complete.
This is a terrible event. It's quite rare in Sydney. This is the first or the second fatal shark attack in 60 years, so it's not a common occurrence, but it does occur. Obviously, it's the Pacific Ocean.
The fatal attack on Saturday morning occurred on a netted beach with the annual installation of 51 shark nets in New South Wales taking place just a week before. Now, shark nets have been a heavily debated topic across Australia, with environmental groups pushing for their removal and arguing against their effectiveness as experts say they don't improve public safety.
Yeah, and that's because in some cases the nets cause other marine life to get caught, which attracts shark who are feeding from these nets. And a lot of experts say that they actually don't operate as a barrier or barricade for sharks. Now, according to authorities, the shark involved in the attack over the weekend, it's believed to be a white shark between 3.4 to 3.6 metres in length, and they are continuing the search for that animal.
The sentence for triple murderer Erin Patterson is set to be handed down today, with the hearing to be broadcasted live for the first time in Victoria. Patterson faces the possibility of life in prison, with her fate being handed down today by Justice Christopher Beale at around 9:30am Eastern Standard Time and will last about 30 minutes.
After an 11-week trial, a jury found Patterson guilty of murdering Don and Gail Patterson, the parents of her estranged husband Simon and his aunt Heather Wilkinson, as well as the attempted murder of Heather's husband Ian Wilkinson, the sole survivor of the deadly Beef Wellington lunch. Patterson will have until the 6th of October to lodge an appeal against her conviction, her sentence, or both.
And this year's US Open is set to wrap up in the next few hours, with Jannik Sinner and Carlos Alcaraz going head-to-head in the men's final as we record these headlines. It comes after the women's final yesterday, where world number one Aryna Sabalenka won her fourth major singles title after winning with straight sets against Amanda Anisimova.
And while we're talking all things tennis and Sabalenka, she was actually asked about her upcoming Battle of the Sexes match against Aussie Nick Kyrgios, which she spoke about on Friday after he claimed he could beat her. Here's what she had to say about that.
It's going to be spectacular to watch. It's going to be fun, especially against someone like Nick. Like he said in another interview, that I genuinely think that I'm going to win. And I'll definitely go out there and I'll try my best to kick his ass.
Oh, and that is a match that we are very, very keen to watch ahead of next year's Oz Open. I know, Helen, you will be watching with bated breath and with plenty of criticism for Nick Kyrgios.
No, just I really want the best player to win, and that will happen on the day. Now, speaking of matches people are keen on, obviously the finals of the US Open attract huge viewership and, many big names and celebrities. And today, sitting in the crowd is US President Donald Trump. And now we know that the match got delayed because of tighter security restrictions around him. But something that I really found interesting was that US Open broadcasters have actually been told not to air any negative reactions, boos, or even cheers from the crowd towards Trump during the final. So I'll be really interested to see how they do that. But someone you won't be hearing from either is me. This is my last headline shift covering Tara and you, Chris, while you were away. So it's been so much fun, but I'm keen to get off the 3 a.m. wake-ups.
Yeah, and I mean, in very true Helen Smith fashion, ladies and gentlemen, she's done her own farewell for us. Helen, you've done an excellent job covering. Thank you so much for covering and letting me be away in the motherland for as long as I was. We really appreciate it. Of course, Tara Cassidy is back tomorrow, fresh from her honeymoon, and she's returning a wedded woman. We can't wait to see her tomorrow. But for now, that is it for headlines. Up next is my deep dive, looking into the return of ISIS brides, those Australian women who ended up in Syria and now are looking at being repatriated by Christmas. Stick around, that deep dive is coming up next. Another group of Australian women and children linked to the Islamic State terror group could reportedly soon be repatriated from Syria, but the government says it's not behind it. It'd be the third time the family members of ISIS fighters would be evacuated from detention camps in the country's northeast, where authorities say around a dozen Australian women and 20 of their kids, the youngest just 5 years old, remain. The women, often referred to as ISIS brides, are among hundreds from Western countries who travelled to or ended up in ISIS-controlled Iraq and Syria between 2013 and 2019 and are still detained following the caliphate's collapse.
We're tired, we're broken, we're shattered, we just want normality for our kids. It's not fair. Most of us didn't even come willingly here. I'm not a refugee. I have a country. What am I doing here?
The plan to get some of them home to New South Wales and Victoria by Christmas is reportedly now in its final stages, with state police confirming they're among the authorities involved in their reintegration. But when asked about it, this is what the Prime Minister had to say.
I confirm that the Australian Government is not providing assistance to this cohort.
And while reports of the plans have been welcomed by humanitarian groups like Save the Children, they have been criticised by the Shadow Defence Minister, the Leader of the Opposition, and some of the usual suspects.
I don't care. I don't want them here. I've got no time for them whatsoever. I don't want their offspring. And the youngest one at 5 years of age, then I ask the question, they are not an Australian citizen. They are bringing their hate. These people are martyrs who will die for the cause and their beliefs.
People who went to fight with ISIS or support ISIS betrayed their country. So I think most Australians said when that happened, goodbye and good riddance.
Prime Minister, these are not ordinary citizens. They chose to align with a barbaric death cult that glorified mass murder, sold women and girls into slavery, and cheered the slaughter of innocents.
So what exactly goes into bringing a group like this home? Why do we know so little about these plans, and how justified are some members of the community in fearing for their safety? Greg Barton is a professor of global Islamic politics at Deakin University, and he joins me now. Greg, welcome back to the briefing. What can you tell us about what life is like for these Australian women and their children right now?
Well, we hear Aroj and Ahol, these two camps. They're not prisons, they're camps for people who have links with Islamic State. We hear them described as just being sort of completely hellish, and that's for several reasons. One is the Syrian Democratic Forces are very constrained with what material they have, so they've got these pretty temporary tent dwellings in the desert. Of course, it's going to be unpleasant. Secondly, Islamic State is still active in the region and still reaches into some of the women in the camps, either to threaten them or to encourage them to stay faithful, because some of them are certainly loyal to Islamic State. And we have women killing women. We have boys, when they reach their 12th birthday, being taken to the men's camp, which is much more of a prison, so where the chances of them being radicalized is much higher. And we have everything you can imagine for a shanty tent city in the desert with a local administration that's struggling to keep things together. We have poor sanitation. We have outbreak of diseases. Just a miserable. Maybe the hardest thing, apart from the physical conditions, is the psychological sense that these people are in a limbo. There's no end date. They haven't been sentenced to a prison term. They're going to stay in the desert, forgotten. They feel perhaps forever.
You mentioned there that the influence of the Islamic State is still very much present and able to reach these women and children. Given that, how much of a security risk does this group pose to the Australian public?
Well, ASIO's written about this and gone to the trouble of making a public statement. And what ASIO, AFP and others have said in the security industry is that the lesser risk is to bring these women and children to Australia. There is risk in doing so, but it's a lesser risk than leaving them where they are. Before Islamic State, had the caliphate that made us all pay attention, it built up for that moment in 2012 and 2013 by breaking people out of prisons around Baghdad. And it was that breaking the walls campaign that gave them the force strength of leaders and foot soldiers to do what they did. So they've got form on breaking people out of prison. There have been prison breaks in northeast Syria. There certainly are attempts and plans for prison breaks. That's always a risk that if we leave people there, they'll be broken out by the Islamic State and then either willingly or as captives join them. But even if that's not the case, these children grow up knowing that they're Australian, that they're linked to Australia. So for those young boys who are taken off to the men's camp and radicalised, that's going to be an issue that's going to be weaponised. And that's a real threat to us in a social media age where people can get recruited online. So it might seem risky to bring these people with this difficult history onshore to Australia, but actually we can manage them onshore, out there in Syria or going on to heaven knows where in future, we have no control.
What does that management process look like, Greg?
Well, the first thing is to try and figure out where people are at, what their trauma needs are, but also to what extent they hold extremist ideas. Some of that is being done now, even before women and children are chosen for repatriation. They'll choose the cases that there's the greatest confidence in as the priority. If this follows the pattern of previous repatriations, they'll be taken into Kurdish northeast Iraq, and they'll spend time there. And once again, a security assessment done of what sort of risks they pose and what sort of needs they have. And then back in Australia, working with counsellors, working with people who have religious knowledge, who can engage with them, just hearing their stories, but basically helping them find a way back to some sort of normal social network and away from the social network that drew them to Syria in the first place, and then it's sort of dominated their lives whilst they've been in these camps. Radicalisation is primarily about socialisation. It's about social networks. And so we think about radicalisation as a cognitive process, changing people's beliefs, and that comes down the line. It's important, but the first thing is to disconnect them, to disengage them. Now, it may be that some of these women will face police charges and court cases, and it may be that some of them will end up in detention. That's part of the deal that they acknowledge they have to be prepared for when they come back. But I think the most will just want to turn their back on what's been a hellish period of their lives. I don't think anyone needs to tell them too much that they've made mistakes and they've done the wrong thing. They've lived through that.
Reports suggest this operation is being organised by a third party, not the government. Is it usual for a third party to be involved in something like this, in something like a repatriation from a country like Syria?
Well, specifically when it comes to repatriating women and children with ISIS associations from Syria, there's been many third parties involved. And it's partly because national governments find it sort of a complex legal limbo and they're reluctant to wade in. The Syrian Democratic Forces, largely Kurdish, has ruled this autonomous northeastern Syrian region since the collapse of the caliphate. But they're not acknowledged as a government by any government in the world. They're not asking for a separate state. They've now found a kind of negotiated peace with the Ashara regime in Damascus. But it's a kind of a strange shadow land. So it's easier for Médecins Sans Frontières or independent journalists or groups like Save the Children that in the past have campaigned for these women and children to come back to Australia. It's easier for them because their modus operandi prepares them to operate in these difficult spaces. By all accounts, for some years now, the security challenges in northeast Syria can be met with experienced professionals. Groups can be escorted across to the Iraqi border and then into a more regular environment where you've got a recognised government in Baghdad and flights back to Australia. And that presumably is what is happening. I mean, it's sometimes made to sound by politicians as if it's impossibly difficult, like it's some sort of Tom Cruise Mission Impossible movie. It's actually fairly straightforward. You speak to journalists who have been there and they say, well, yeah, you have to be careful, but it's not as if you can't talk to people and meet with people and make the transit from in and out of Syria. It's entirely possible.
When it comes to this group that's expected to arrive by Christmas, we're kind of piecing together the narrative based on media reports. It's very different to kind of the scenes and the information that we were receiving the last two times that repatriations happened. The first being under Scott Morrison in 2019, where we had 8 children returned to Australia. And then the second in 2022 under the Albanese government, where there were 4 women and 13 children returned. What's making this situation a little bit different? What lessons have been learned that, we're kind of not getting the same level of transparency?
Yeah, we don't have the same level of transparency, but the flip side is that's for an intentional and I think good reason. Those 2 previous repatriations, there was some good publicity and some correct media reporting, a lot in fact. Scott Morrison, to his credit, said that the children do not bear the sins of their parents, that they deserved a chance back in Australia. I think the public can understand that, but there's a lot of confusion in the Australian public. And so with the second repatriation, when you had some cases where there'd been encounters with media and mistakes made on all sides, it just added to that febrile sort of speculation about, well, these women have done something stupid and bad. Why should we be helping? They should be left there forever. Way too simplistic and misses out a whole lot of points, not least our security concerns, but also our legal and humanitarian responsibilities. So I think the firm feeling now is let's help these women and children get back to a normal state, become Australians who can contribute to society, and then their stories can be told. But if you start trying to tell the stories in the middle of the process, it's fraught with risk.
Speaking of 2022, there was a campaign led by a few mayors in Sydney's West, and that seemed to dominate the political response and coverage of these repatriations, and a big focus for them were concerns around safety and security. We're seeing something similar now. We're starting to see those narratives coming through this time around too. How justified are, locals in these suburbs where these people will be repatriated and returning to? How justified are they in feeling a little bit concerned for their safety?
Well, I think when anyone expresses concern for safety and there's a complex issue like this, you have to take seriously what they're saying. And people have a reason for speaking of their anxieties. It doesn't mean that their analysis is right. And I think the analysis is not right in this case. I think the risks will be very well managed by a large team of people who have expertise. And I don't believe this represents any great threat to society. We need to remember that the reality of life in Australia, as in every other place on earth, is people do bad things. As they say, you do the crime, you do the time. They go to prison, sometimes come out much the worse for it, often find a way back to family and society and are rehabilitated. But very often that's not the case. I believe the chances of success with these women, and even more perhaps with the children, is higher than the case of people coming out of regular prison detention. because the resources are more expert and there's so much goodwill towards making this work and so many checks and balances. Now, the Australian government may not be hands-on on the ground bringing these women and children back to Australia. They will certainly be keeping an eye on them. They'll certainly be monitoring. They'll certainly be making sure that the checks and balances are in place. And unfortunately, that's not the case with, people coming out of prison on other serious crimes of assault, where often there's not the level of surveillance. There will be the surveillance in this case. And actually, that means, although it's a more traumatic case, the resources are much more complete and the levels of risk are lower.
Greg Barton, thank you so much for joining us again on The Briefing.
Thanks very much, Chris.
That was Professor Greg Barton from Deakin University speaking with me there. And that is it for this episode of The Briefing. Feel free to send this episode to someone who you think might get something out of it. And while you're there, feel free to chuck us a review and a rate wherever you are listening. I'm Chris Spyrou. Catch you next time.